With humanity branching out amongst the stars and securing our place in the universe, we really had no idea at any given point in time that really this galaxy was just one giant farm. Untold magnitudes of species before us had fallen to a similar grisly fate, complete annihilation. As a species would ascend up the technological scale, one thing would always be a constant need, and that thing is energy. And unfortunately, energy is not as easy to come by as you might expect for an ever-scaling need for it. Once you figure out fire, you'll then cut down a forest just to stay warm. When you figure out oil exists, you'll pull it up from the ground until there's really none left and burn it. When you figure out how to harness the sun's energy with a dinosphere, you will then spread across the solar system, sucking that star dry until eventually you're gonna need to move on to support your ever-growing population. Much like a bacterial culture, the more energy and resources in the environment, the more growth will happen, and ultimately using more and more at a faster rate until you pretty much need to move on to desperate measures. This prevailing theme of life stems from the very cells that make up a living creature's body, and then is exhibited on a macro scale. Something would take note of this in the far-flung past and began using it to its own means. At some point, while not really confirmed lore-wise, I believe there was something extra-dimensional that was able to get a glimpse into our dimensional plane of existence, which became very intrigued by the life that was flourishing within the Milky Way and possibly even in other galaxies. Now, the question as always is, how did this end up happening at first? Honestly, I believe there was a species who ran into some problems, as all life does. Once realizing that the energy requirements of their species would surpass the actual known energy that our current universe could provide, they would then decide to attempt to tap into a more theoretical plane of existence in order to take energy from those areas that they had probably just assumed was empty. Now, disclaimer, this is all a hypothesis as to why everything went down the way it did, but to me, it makes the most amount of sense given how the Brethren Moons operate. Anyhow, once tapping into this plane of existence, the original species would then build conduits that could harness this energy, and for a time, it may have worked out pretty well for them, but ultimately, something horrific would begin to take notice. It was likely not really known how or why the Brethren Moons, or the species that controls the Brethren Moons, chose to take on the giant meatball form as a physical manifestation of themselves, but they came to know how the markers would operate, and this most likely is why it didn't matter once this initial species was discovered. Upon opening that hypothetical rift to siphon energy from this plane of just wherever they came from, Cthulhu's maybe there, this race had their fate sealed along with most other life in the galaxy. Spreading like space herpes, what happened to the original species is the same thing that would begin happening to every other race that would then rise up. Likely at first it was just pure chance that the markers would be found by anything else and then adapted to just dispensing energy for freezies. But as they would continue to find these markers, any planet that used them would be converted into a Brethren Moon as the network of available knowledge shared amongst the Brethren Moons would become more vast. It is likely the original markers sent out to guide a species towards like a certain desired formation comes from the original markers creation from the first race. Other ones after come from other animals that would find it. In the events of dead space, this is likely the pathway the spreading of the markers and the mutagenic sickness contained within began moving across the cosmos. For humanity, we would be spared the initial, onslaught, as you could say, as the Tau Volantians had stopped the spread of the Brethren Moons potentially in our galaxy by stopping the formation of the moon in the first place by freezing it. However, this would only turn out to be a slight reprieve as humanity would then find the black marker on our world, which was sent here by the Brethren Moons that then wiped out the dinosaurs. And this would result in monsters being formed that would lead to today's topic. As the Ishimura was overrun with absolute, just cracked out looking things, a bunch of unitologist nerds caused this by bringing on board the marker and being absolute chodes. Many creatures will begin to pop up and convert human meat suits into meat walls and meat floors, but walking creatures as well. One such creature is known as the Lurker. This beast formed from what would be considered contraband and is fairly unique concerning the background that it has, as it highlights specifically how human brains disrupt the marker from fully taking over the body, necessitating the need for the marker to actually destroy the human brain in order to kind of utilize the meat suit for what it wants to. So in today's episode, let's discuss the lore and physiology of the Lurker in Dead Space and find out how it became what it did. But before moving on, as always, I want to thank you guys for watching. Without you, this channel would be absolutely nothing, so you guys are ballers. I have a gaming channel now called Roanoke Games. A hater said I should call it Roanoke like cinema or film reviews. Listen, bro, accurate and not unfair, but words hurt. So with the marker brought up from Aegis 7, which was just a galaxy brain take by Unitology leadership, given there was actively a form of insanity spreading on the planet and Necromorphs were already known to be forming at this point, the humans located on the Ishimura would be overwhelmed by the same hallucinations and aggression that was taking place below. Beginning with the least intelligent crewmates, as Those with elevated IQs appeared to be able to handle the marker signal, at least for a little while, would begin experiencing forms of insomnia as they would lash out at the other crew members or react in fear as if they had seen something. Now, I do want to highlight at this point that even some form of a brain appears to offer a resistance to the marker signal. The ultimate goal of the marker is to create biomass for the upcoming hive mind and eventually the formation of a full-on brother moon. Remember that. As the crewmates began falling, eventually it would then spread to engineers, the officers, the scientists, and the doctors whose mind's ability to work out what the symbols meant could not ultimately protect them from the effects forever. Even to that point, Necromorphs were starting to stalk the shadows and begin to enter vents of the ship to drag people away from their workstations. Over the course of a few days, people began to notice that others were not showing up for their shifts, which would be really annoying, and it became apparent that something horrible must have happened. To this point, the Necromorph outbreak would follow a very standard path with a few deviations worth mentioning because it highlights why variants would form. As mentioned in my videos over Necromorphs prior, humanity had to be approached with a different measure because as a species, we may have presented more of an obstacle for the Brother Moons to overcome. Some of our species were outright immune to the marker signal, such as Lexine Weller, and still others were resistant, such as Isaac, and even then, others would still put up a fight by erecting barricades and fighting with anything that they had. If you had to take a look at the Talvalantians in contrast, their species appears to have their oceans conquered, but it appears that there is really just one form of alien necromorph concerning their race, which means adaptation of the necromorph was not as necessary for their planet to be overrun. Humanity just stays taking W's. So this need to alter forms to fit specific jobs, whether it be denial of an area, zero-G environment attacks, defensive measures, or scythes to cut through armor, the necromorph had to be molded for a job that it needed to conduct in order to counter humanity's jack-of-all-trades status. And one such counter was our literal technology that was initially designed to be intentionally helpful that would then present problems for us down the line, resulting in the removal of limbs rather than the reattachment that they were initially created for. The Lurker necromorph is something that would be highly useful to repairing the human body in its original form, and now it's turned into something that does the exact opposite. It also shows what was happening on the ship just by natural human compulsion. But what's interesting is when entering the medical wing of the Ishimura, you will find vats of human younglings just pretty much all around. Some have suggested that this is because they were using the shock point drive of warping across the galaxy, which could damage the human body developing. So they were then taken and then placed in vats to protect them. I'm gonna have to disagree with that one because what the Ishimura is doing is actually cited in the lore as very illegal. This process is known as contraband according to EarthGov, but this flagrant violation of law is done for a specific reason. Working with heavy moving machinery in the mining operations that they were conducting, damage to the human meat suit was quite common. For those that have their arms or legs crushed or cut off due to working conditions they intrinsically have to be in, these offspring would be utilized and harvested for their limbs and organs in order to repair older adults. Now, this process is not massively barbaric, given that it was stated that the younglings in the vats actually do not have brains. They still do possess, however, a spinal cord and all other organs and muscles and bones in case the crew would need them. So it looks like an offspring, but there's nobody home, so to speak. I can hear you now, but Roanoke, wouldn't that cause an issue of organ rejection if you were to just take that? I mean, you know, World War II, there was some horrific stuff going on where they were trying to attach limbs to people who were already alive. It did not go well. So it would seem under normal circumstances that, yeah, it would be pretty bad, but I think this highlights something about these templates that are in the vats. I believe the process works as such. When a worker is injured, there is a key gene missing within the vat-grown humans, and that is the HLA or human leukocyte antigen. This antigen is responsible for delineating a cell as self. Without it, your body will regard whatever has been surgically implanted or attached as a foreign organism and will attack it with the immune system. And this is why when you get an organ transplant, you are required to be on immunosuppressants to prevent a life-threatening condition from taking place. And that's pretty much your immune system attacking that new organ. When the arm or organ or leg or spinal cord is taken from a vat-grown human, they will then have their genes edited using a collection of genes coding for glycoprotein molecules known as the major histocompatibility complex, or MHC, in order for these new cells to begin expressing the correct antigen for the person injured so that this new limb or organ can be properly attached to the body in order to increase the quality of life of that individual or completely even solve a problem as if it never happened in the first place. Well, except for the horrific memory and pain you likely experienced in being injured in that way. I mean, you're not gonna forget that. But what's wild is right now, potentially using CRISPR and the gene editing tools that we have at our disposal, it could be entirely possible by utilizing this method, we could in fact achieve this outcome in the future. Basically, it would require us taking genes that code for these glycoproteins that will then present on the cell surface of any new cells that you add to your body so that your body is like, oh yeah, these are my cells, I'm not really worried about it. but this is going to require a lot of research for us to achieve in the future. But it is not only just limbs and organs, but the vat-grown humans, given their age, could also likely have a high amount of stem cells that could be utilized in the process of fixing more localized issues, such as, say, a little bit of nerve damage, or facilitating faster healing if there's like a muscle tear or a bone is broken. But the main issue with all of this, however, would be the philosophical question of, is it life? Now, I'm just some random dude on the internet, so it's not really up for me to decide, but EarthGov had already deemed this particular form of medical practice illegal, but clearly, considering the facility was already built onto the Ishimura already, and the ship is, I think it's like 70 years old at this point, it may have been an older science, but only recently had been outlawed, and the Ishimura was already showing up in quarantine zones to basically mine whatever they want and look for markers. They didn't really care. So also, if you're not sure what stem cells are, they are essentially template cells. They have not differentiated and exist in an unaltered state. It's important to remember that you come from two haploid cells. Once combining during fertilization, for a brief period in time, you are in fact a single cell that is diploid. These cells then divide, and depending on the direction of signaling molecules during gestation, this causes your cells to express different genes in certain areas, which in turn causes you to begin forming muscle, bone, nerves, basically everything that makes you you. Some of these cells, though, never differentiate, as your body will use them to repair other areas of your body to a degree if possible. And what sort of blows about the whole concept of stem cell studies being shut down, I think it was back like in 2008, maybe it was even earlier than that. Adults actually have stem cells which could be tested on to learn about the effects. It is known that if you take stem cells and then place them near other cells, you can in fact use them because they will differentiate into what the nearby cells are. Obviously, for something like neurological damage, this would be hugely beneficial, but soon enough we will likely fire back up those studies because you hear a lot now about basically like stem cell adjacent studies. So we're getting closer back to kind of studying those, which depending on where you're taking the stem cells, I can see why some people get angry, but there's also a lot of fear mongering about testing with stem cells and a lot of misinformation, which cause people to be like, no, we need to stop that immediately. So just make sure when you're looking into something, you're looking into what the actual facts are, not just what you're being told. Anyhow, back to the lurkers. So the key here is to remember they lack any sort of brain, which in turn means that then they were exposed to the marker signal, there was really nothing standing in the way concerning alterations to their cells or functions. You have to remember that the marker affects all cells, not just human cells, so even bacterial cells will be corrupted and changed into the biomass that then covers the walls. An entire ecosystem is broken down for its biomass. Sounds like some Tyranid actions, which we'll be covering in the future, so keep an eye out for that. So due to this process taking place almost immediately with the marker signal coming into range, the bodies of these vat-grown templates would quickly be transformed into monsters, while the humans around it may have been feeling the effects but didn't quite drop yet. Now, the important thing also remember is these vats are sealed. There's nothing that would indicate to me that they were actually exposed to the viral bacteria that generally comes with a marker outbreak, because if you actually look, there are none of the basically concussive force detonating younglings like in Dead Space 2. There are actually only lurkers. So that says to me if the offspring is subjected to the viral bacteria, which as we know likely produces a type of gas that allows it to concussively detonate, then they are turned into those from Dead Space 2. But if they are in a vat and they are only changed by the marker signal, then they appear to just turn into lurkers. Now, I also want to point out, I think it's probably fairly similar as to with the pregnant necromorphs. When the lurkers finally come out of them, they aren't really exposed to the viral bacteria either. They're just exposed mostly to the marker, because we kind of see too many of these things running around, which indicates that the crewmates were doing what crewmates do, which is mate. So they would have their offspring changed by these creatures. There is, however, two variants of this creature, which let's take a look at their morphology to see what happened utilizing this template. So the first thing to note is unlike the slashers, brutes, leapers, or any other larger necromorph composed of an adult or multiple adults, lurkers do not possess the biomass necessary for an open attack on an adult unless they wanted to get punted by Isaac at Mach 5. As a result of this smaller stature, these creatures will prefer ranged attacks over the standard open confrontation. However, seeing a chance to attack a human who's injured and possibly extremely weak due to it, they will most definitely go in for a kill shot. But before getting to see what happens when exposed to the marker signal for a long enough time, you need to know where we start with this one. Starting with the hand feet, we see this creature is now completely quadrupedal as opposed to how it naturally would be. The lurker will walk on its knuckles more often than not and then crawl on its knees. The legs are in standard proportion to the rest of the body as not much would need to change, but the stomach of this creature now has tentacles exiting out of the abdomen area that do support it. These tentacles have several purposes, but the main one is being able to help facilitate locomotion and attach attached to walls and ceilings. While muscular contractions are still fairly strong in Necromorphs, to get the jumping range this creature has, these tentacles would need to work in a similar way to the back tentacles, allowing to rapidly contract and then blast into a direction that it would need to go. You can kind of think of it similar to like a pistol shrimp and how biological catches exist to build up the potential energy until it is all released at once, absolutely launching the lurker. The tentacles of the abdomen are very likely either intestinal in nature, seeing as smooth muscle is still just that, muscle, or it could be the remnants of the umbilical cord that was used to keep pumping nutrients into the template. As we look at the rest of the body, we see the head is still there, but the jaw is missing. The nose is present and the eyes are milky white. It's clear in some capacity the head is still used for its original purpose of sight, and it's able to shriek still, as can be heard with its attacks. Tentacles exit out of the mouth, which is still pretty much par for the course actually, because if you look at other Necromorphs, they have a lot of this going on as well. So you need to understand the outside of the creature though is really just a covering that is supposed to psychologically screw with you. This outside, it does two things. First, the Brotherhood of Moons are very aware of the psychological damage that can be done to a species when their offspring is brought into the mix. By losing the offspring, the parents will then fall into depression and become reckless, further allowing for the marker signal to work on them, or for them to be added to biomass due to carelessness. The outside covering of the lurker is also just that, a covering. It has become hard and leathery, bolstering against damage that may incur, but also allowing it to still retain sort of a visage of what most humans would find absolutely abhorrent. But the real money shot is the tentacles on the back. Long muscular tendrils will break through the spine of the template about mid-lumbar. Appearing to hail from the pelvic region mostly, this would indicate that this is likely in some capacity the spinal erector muscles, while some of it may be the intestines. Lurker is able to use these tendrils in a whip-like motion as barbs are located at the ends of them. It would seem the lurker may prefer to use the vertebrae of its own body as these actual projectiles. Throwing them at a high rate of speed, not only are they thrown like by the whip, but it also seems to be in a capacity, as we will see later, that these projectiles may be fired out of the tube. The combination of these two forms of throwing will allow the jagged vertebrae to hit their target, greatly injuring the person who is not wearing armor. In some ways, this may literally detonate a skull if it hits with enough force. So as the lurkers continue to be exposed to the marker signal, as discussed in my enhanced Necromorph episode, which you should go check that out, this will cause it to become more durable, as the marker signal does cause cells to become more adhesive and stick to one another with greater cohesion, as bone begins to also crop up in the body, covering weak points. Through this process, however, a mini brute will be formed. A lot of people may not have noticed, but with the enhanced lurkers later in the game, you will find they've actually become two of the templates, or they are just homegrown offspring fused together. Looking at the creature overall, not only have the limbs doubled, but the faces are now much wider, and it possesses 4 eyes with one head just grafted over the other. They will appear larger now, about the size of 1.5 human torsos, and with it, the throwing tentacles have become stronger. But interestingly, if you look at the tentacles, it may be a little hard to show, but the protrusions on them do appear like an Ubermorph face, the beginning of a spitter face, or the Brotherhood of Moons face. I find it interesting how certain structures will continue to permeate different variants of Necromorphs the longer they are exposed to the marker signal. Being in enhanced form, the covering is also thicker, as it is literally doubled up, and again, bone has begun forming in sheaths over it. The muscle tissue also allows for stronger tentacles, it's been doubled, and the vertebrae are also more readily available on the top of the lurker. All of this makes it much more dangerous as a threat to those who are either in a hallway or try to escape it to the relative safety of space. Now, the lurker choosing to keep range, given its smaller stature, does not mean it doesn't know how to actively attack. Once getting close enough to a person with range no longer being an option, or seeing that they are injured or weak, it will then jump on the person and then begin stabbing them with the tentacles, as well as the vertebrae that it is holding in those tentacles. This process, if you're not wearing some form of rig armoring, would then lead to your skin being pierced, and then you being stabbed in the upper chest and neck region, leading to a rapid bleed out. However, with Isaac, multiple stabs have to be used to breach the armor, but then once entering the relatively weaker area of the neck armoring, it will pierce his neck, severing likely the sternocleidomastoid muscle that holds your neck forward. Once this is severed, this is why his neck cocks back really far, as nothing is no longer pulling his head forward. The lurker will then fire the vertebrae through his neck, severing the rest of the muscle and major blood vessels. This vertebrae is fired with enough force that will speed through Isaac's cervical vertebrae and then through his spinal cord, decapitating him in the process. However, prior to that happening, you remember these things are only like 10 pounds. It's sort of like fighting Chucky, just grab him and punt him. So getting a hold of this thing, manhandling it to the ground, put me in, coach, I'm ready to play. With a full kick to the relatively unarmored underside of this thing, you can almost completely bisect the lurker injuring it to the point of incapacitation. Because remember, Necromorphs, even dismembered, they're not actually dead, they just can't move as the structures used to move have been broken. The Lurkers were created to counter people running to space to kind of exit out of the area and protect themselves. Along with this, the psychological damage that can do to a person that sees them or once knew them, such as a parent, would be quite profound, and is exactly why the Brother of Moons would want this to take place. However, given their small stature and kind of lack of biomass, they are relatively weak combatants, and if you remember you're like 10 times their size and you're wearing some armor, I mean, just full on bull rush these things and start stomping them X gonna give it to you style. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great of you, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. It's great to be doing some Dead Space again. I think we are approaching the end of this Dead Space. Hopefully, once upon a time they said Dead Space 2 was going to come out, the remake or remaster of it. I think that's pretty much been dropped at this point because EA just sucks at life, as per usual, but it is what it is. What are you gonna do? Anyhow, I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Games channel link. And there's also a new episode going up on Roanoke Tales. But anyhow, I would also like to thank my patrons real quick. First, I'd like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer, and Feather. Thank you guys. Next, I'd like to thank our scientists, Dakota23, Invictus Echo, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, Scoot Boo, and Virix Hellstrom. Thank you guys as well. And to the rest of my patrons, I do appreciate y'all's continued support. And as always, I love you. All right, parasocial nonsense aside, I hope everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.